Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased to have you all with us today. My name is Phil Hansen. I am the president of Global Minnesota, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Navigating a World in Turmoil with Fiona Hill. I'm just so thrilled to have all of you joining us here at the Minneapolis Central Library. We want to say a huge thank you to them for helping us have this venue to be able to share this program with you. In my experience with the Global Minnesota, this is the first time where we've actually moved a venue 3 times to accommodate an ever-increasing group of people, and we appreciate some of you making the machinations with us to make this work out today. So great to have you all here. For those of you that are not familiar with Global Minnesota, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, membership-based organization. We're dedicated to advancing international understanding and engagement in the world. Last year, Global Minnesota hosted some 50 professional exchange delegations from all over the world, participants from 130 different countries. We hosted 75 world affairs events featuring visiting diplomats and journalists, foreign policy experts. We delivered special international programs for our grade schools, K through 12, as well as college students in our schools across Minnesota. For our business community, we provided programs on sustainability topics, on international trade, global trends and challenges, foreign policy, in all over, believe it or not, 450 activities last year that inspired 15,000 people to help us learn about and connect with an ever-changing world. And so you're all, many of you, a part of that, and we're very thankful for that. We have a wonderful membership that supports the organization. I want to thank our individual members who are in the room with us today. I always ask members in the room, would you guys raise your hands for everyone? All right, so look around carefully for those with their hands not up, and you need to help them, or those that didn't put your hand up, find one of those nice folks, and they'll tell you how great it is to be a member here with Global Minnesota. When you become a member with Global Minnesota, you become part of a community that shares your interest in encouraging dialogue, creating connections and understanding of how world affairs and foreign policy affect us all. For over 7 decades now, we've been providing our members with a nonpartisan gathering place, which is increasingly important today, where people can connect with influential world leaders, gain exposure to different cultures and viewpoints, and hear firsthand insights about the critical international topics of our times. Global Minnesota shares the best of Minnesota with the world, and the best of the world with Minnesota as well. As you can see by the screen up here, you too can become a member, help us kind of power this mission, and receive benefits like special event invitations, discounts on major foreign policy publications, discounted admission to our paid programming. And for today only, the first 5 new members who sign up will receive a complimentary signed book by Fiona Hill for her memoir, There is Nothing for You Here. Take advantage of this opportunity. See Alex in the membership table outside. I see people running to the door now. No, it's okay. So hopefully that works out. So we're just excited but do take a look at membership. It's a great organization. We have an incredible slate of programming and really terrific people we get a chance to share with all of you like Fiona Hill. And lastly, we want to take 1 minute just to thank our many corporate members that help our organization succeed. We're very thankful for their support and their dedication to helping us increase international understanding. Before I begin, I want to remind you all that we'll be taking audience questions today via the question cards. So some of you picked up cards as you were coming in. If you need cards, Katie back here can set you up with more of those, along with a pencil to write your questions down. So if you have a question for Fiona, please write it on the card, and a member of the team hold it up, come around, collect that from you, and share it with our moderator today. Here we go. So it's an honor to have with us today former presidential advisor and Brookings Institution senior fellow, Fiona Hill. Her insights into foreign policy decisions at the highest levels of government provide a valuable resource as we look to navigate and understand what's happening in our world today. To help us introduce our very special guest, I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Well, he's already on stage, so I'm welcoming him already up here. Well settled, I think, over there. Our own Ross Wilson, our board chair for Global Minnesota, as well as Ambassador Ross Wilson. For nearly 4 decades, Ambassador Wilson represented the United States in his career as a career diplomat at home and abroad. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and to Turkey. In 2014, Ambassador Wilson was called back to government service as the head of mission and charge d'affaires for Turkey, and again in the Republic of Georgia in 2018. And also you returned to Afghanistan in 2021 to lead the U.S. Embassy. You guys just failed at retirement, didn't you? Completely. You kept calling you back. We're very lucky to have such a wonderful and skilled man as both our chair of our programs and to have his great wisdom and insight into all things foreign policy for our organization. So I'd like to invite Ross forward to give you an introduction, maybe it's right from where you're at there, Ross, an introduction of Fiona. You got to look over at your board chair and see what he really wants. So we'll leave Ross there. And it's just such a pleasure to have Ross with us today and have Fiona Hill with us today. I hope you enjoy the program, everyone. Ross.
Thank you very much, Phil, and welcome to all of you here this afternoon for this conversation about navigating a world in turmoil. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Fiona Hill, one of our country's and the world's most preeminent experts on Russia and the former Soviet space. Just to amplify on what Phil said, Dr. Hill has spent many years, and is spending years now at the Brookings Institution in Washington, heading up its work on Russia and the former Soviet Union. From Brookings, she was plucked in 2006 to serve as National Intelligence Officer for Russia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council, a position that's probably little known and less understood outside the Beltway, but absolutely critical in the way that the United States government looks at, thinks about, and frames the problem of Russia for its policymakers. She was called back again in 2017 to serve, as Phil noted, as Senior Director at the National Security Council for Russia and Eurasia, Deputy Assistant to the President, at an extremely interesting time that I think we can all agree. Two things that are absolutely testimony to her skills and her abilities. She's a graduate of Harvard University, graduate degree from Harvard University and St. Andrews University, the author of many publications, and two I would highlight: Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which is one of the preeminent books looking at and assessing Putin and what kind of person he is, and also her personal memoir, There Is No Place for You, which I can't commend enough as a gripping, difficult, also in many places quite humorous account of Dr. Hill's term at the White House, the challenges of working as a woman in government in general, and in particular in that White House, and what were her experiences and how things went down with respect to Russia and especially with respect to Ukraine, and much of which is well documented in the testimony that she gave before Congress in 2019. She's a colleague. We've known each other for 25 years, I believe, something like that, a friend, and someone whose intellect and fearlessness I greatly admire. Welcome. Glad to have you with us. So we'll start with a conversation about three sets of things. First, about Russia today and Putin, on where he's taking the country, including where he's taking it in Ukraine, and focus a little bit on that. Second, the larger context, the more global context, in which Russia is one source of disruptive change, abetted by and cooperating to some extent with China, with Iran, with North Korea, not to mention other international and transnational problems that are also factors that are dramatically reshaping the world we live in today. And then third, about what all this turmoil and what these challenges mean for us, for our country's security and welfare, and hopefully some thoughts about what should guide America's response. As Phil noted, we'll open the floor then to questions from you. The more legible your questions are, the more likely they'll be used. I will endeavor in the time I'm available to draw from as many of them as I can to work through the rest of the conversation. So let's dive right into this. For nearly 50 years, really the bulk of my professional and personal life, for that matter, Russia represented the principal threat to our country's security and our way of life. The Cold War's end seemed to put that in the rearview mirror. But something like that Russian bogeyman of the past seems now increasingly before us today. You're one of the world's leading experts. You've met Putin. You've authored a book about him. Talk to us about a little bit about the man, the leader he became, and where he's taken his country and why.
Well, thanks very much, Ross. It's really wonderful to be here, and to Phil and to everyone from Global Minnesota. I actually love Minneapolis, so I'm very pleased to be here. My husband happens to have been born here in Minneapolis, so I've got lots of family ties, and my nephew's currently studying at the university, and I got to see him yesterday for coffee. So, there's lots of personal connections. And, really, I'm sure that not for you sitting here in the audience, but for many people, they really are trying to figure out, how do we get here again? I mean, I can, I don't want to be rude, but I can see a few people from my sort of generation around here in the audience. And many of us are wondering, just like Ross and I are, who started off, studying Russian. I started studying Russian in 1984, which was obviously a pretty meaningful time against the backdrop of the war scare and over the placing of nuclear missiles in Europe. The standoff of the kind of peak of the Cold War between the United States and Europe, the kind of equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but for the 1980s. And I never thought we'd be back here again, talking about the prospect of perhaps a nuclear war in Europe. I mean, it just seemed inconceivable, when we think about all of the events that have transpired, since, especially if for those of us, who were around in 1991, some people here were probably not born until after that, to kind of think about after the collapse of the Soviet Union that we'd be seeing, efforts to put it back again. I mean, there was the Beatles song Back in the USSR, but I don't think any of us really thought that that would be, kind of where we would be again today. And of course, there are some distinct differences here, which gets, to the heart of Ross's question about how do we get back to this place, is that the end of the Soviet Union was the end of the communist system. And we certainly, with the demise of communism in the Soviet Union, with the actual rejection of it under not Mikhail Gorbachev, who actually was quite a committed communist but wanted to reform it, but under Boris Yeltsin and all of the leaders of the former Soviet republics that became new states, we kind of thought, well, okay, well, that's all gone now. What we didn't pay attention to was the long kind of drive of history. And this is how we've ended up, in a way, seeming to go back to the past, because for some people within Putin's orbit, that weight of history has been really significant. And in the 1990s, just like in many places where you've got dramatic change, we're doing the same here. I mean, what's one of the slogans in our 2024 election is "Make America Great Again," as if it's a kind of a back to the past. And this is really kind of what Putin decided or set about to do in 2000 when he formally became the president. He was basically named as acting president by Boris Yeltsin in December of 1999. And he had a very famous speech, a kind of a message that he gave to the Russian population on the eve of the new millennium of 2000. And although it didn't say, literally make Russia great again, it was basically an affirmation of his intent to restore Russia's position, first of all, domestically, because we'd had really the collapse of the Russian state in the 1990s, but then to kind of put Russia back on the international scene again. Now, I don't think Putin himself had necessarily decided back into 2000 that that would mean invading Ukraine. I don't think that was the case at all. But over the period of time, as he's searching for this kind of rationale of a new Russia to go kind of forward into the 21st century, he finds himself in his own mind circling back into previous centuries. And if you listen to the Tucker Carlson interview, he took himself back to the 9th century, and trying to kind of find that link. Even I remember Tucker Carlson even says, sorry, President Putin, is this relevant? Because, I mean, it's basically that idea of trying to look for historical signposts, and every country does it, particularly countries that have gained independence. I grew up in the UK. If you went through a kind of a course in elementary school of British history, you would have got the myth making that we've all made about the Romans, the Vikings, the Normans, all the kind of people who invade, and our different stories about all of this. You'd have got strange threads of what British history, British Empire, Queen Victoria, Empress of India, etc., etc. And, you know, for Russia and, you know, for people like Putin, Russia had never existed as a kind of standalone state because it also built up, just like, you know, England and Britain did, always as an empire. And England, as you well are aware, still doesn't really have a proper identity. They did a branding exercise a few years ago to say what was the idea of England. And it was the Queen, fish and chips and tea. I mean, that's not really, you know, a lot to kind of put the basis of a, you know, whole national identity on, but it kind of shows, you know, how difficult it is to find common images. And we're having a lot of that at the same time, aren't we? And, you know, what is it that, you know, kind of basically pulls a country together? And so Putin has really kind of tried to create a kind of a pastiche version of a new Russian idea. And that was a big debate in the 1990s under Yeltsin again, by going back and just taking a kind of grab bag of Russian history. So that has led him, you know, very sadly, to the determination in February of 2022 to invade Ukraine, because he's been telling himself, as well as telling Russians and Ukrainians, especially since he came back into the presidency again. But at that point, that would have been the third time, because he's doing a lot of these, you know, presidential terms at the moment. That Russia was basically defined by its ties to Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia were one country, and that the origins of Russia are in Kiev and Rusa, and, you know, basically ancient history in the 9th century, you know, with this tracing of history back to that point. So over time, Putin has gone from what we might have described in many respects as a kind of more practical politician. There was, you know, he went in different directions, you know, for quite a lot of time in the first two presidencies until, you know, we get to this point on building up the Russian economy. We'd have had a very different debate about Putin if he hadn't come back to the presidency in 2011, 2012. We'd have actually said he was a pretty successful Russian president, because the Russian economy gets transformed in the first two terms. Russia is back on the world stage again as a major economic player, genuinely part of the G7, G8. You know, he's stabilized the Russian state. It's no longer bankrupt. You know, we might have had a few quibbles about things happening in Chechnya and elsewhere, but we would have had a very different view than where we are now. And now he's gone back to this idea of regathering Russian lands, recreating a version of at least a Russian Slavic empire, and thinking of himself as, in many respects, a Russian Tsar. And I say that because when you're saying, you know, what kind of person is he now? He's a person who's living in historical myth. Again, something that he wasn't doing earlier on. And having just run re-election back in March with no real competition and getting 88% of the vote, something he's never had before, because, you know, all opposition has literally been eliminated, including, of course, the death of Alexei Navalny just a month before the election. He is now off to his umpteenth term. He now has 6-year terms, taking him up to 2030. And in theory, he could run and be in office until 2036, by which time he will also be in his 80s. He stopped talking about the age of our current political presidential candidates, because he'll be beyond that age himself by 2036. But by that time, he will have outlasted or outreigned Catherine the Great, who was in office for office. At that time, it wasn't office, was it? It was on the throne for 34 years. And also Stalin, Joseph Stalin, who was the Secretary General of the Soviet Union, of the Communist Party, and head of the Soviet Union for 30 years. So Putin is actually measuring himself now of the yardstick of Joseph Stalin and Catherine the Great. So I think that really kind of tells at least where his mindset in his head is. And everything that Putin talks about is in terms of the past and not the future. So, you know, we've really got ourselves into a very, and he has got himself into, I think, a rather very uncomfortable place. He was the president of the future in 2000 for the 21st century, and he's now increasingly the president who talks about the 9th century at the same time that he's laying waste to Ukraine.
Just to stick with that for a second, he's the president of the past. Yeah. How do Russians feel about that? And I asked that question in part. There was a recent article, I think, in the New Yorker that cites some polling to the effect that Russians feel more positive about Russia today than at any time since Putin came into office. Some of that's propaganda. Maybe a lot of that is successful propaganda at work by the media, but surely there are other things going on. Could you just expand a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of it is this is the 25th year that he's been in office, either as president or prime minister. And, you know, there's probably a few people here who are in their 20s, you know, and you tend to have a different view of things if the only president you've ever known is Vladimir Putin. I mean, when I was a young person, Margaret Thatcher was, you know, kind of the only person that I could kind of think of as a prime minister. It was actually interesting, you know, first woman prime minister. You know, I was like, oh, can men be prime ministers? You know, it's like, it gives you a different perspective, right? And I wasn't like I particularly like Margaret Thatcher, but you know, she was a pretty dominant presence. You know, it's like so she was my image of a prime minister. It was Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. So for many people, the only person that they can actually think of as, you know, the head of state in Russia is Vladimir Putin. And then if they look back, you know, before Putin, they had Boris Yeltsin, you know, was notorious for, you know, I mean, you and Margot were in, you know, kind of Moscow at that time. Everybody was always remembering Yeltsin for drinking too much, you know, embarrassing people by conducting orchestras on, you know, kind of the airports when he sort of got off the plane. And also people thinking that, you know, he was really presiding over the collapse of Russia. The Russian state went bankrupt. And lost its position in the world. And prior to that, it was called Mikhail Gorbachev, who we all thought of, I mean, actually, along with Yeltsin, very positively. I mean, I think, you know, most people, you know, of our age would look back to the time, think, thank God for Gorbachev. You know, he brought the Cold War to an end, but for an awful lot of people, he also brought the state to an end. And that's, of course, you know, for Putin's point of view, he brought the end of the Soviet Union. And for Putin, it wasn't the communist system. He wasn't a member of the Communist Party. His parents were not either, although one of his grandparents was Stalin's cook, which must have been a very dangerous job, you know, kind of back in the time. So it's probably why Putin likes to poison people. He's kind of thinking about, you know, kind of all the prospects of, anyway, that's a digression. But I mean, basically, for people like Putin and, you know, many others, Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Empire. So when he said, for example, you know, back in, I think it was 2015, that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the state, he didn't mean the end of communism. He meant the collapse of the Russian state. And so when you start to talk to people today, they've intrinsically tied Putin to the Russian state. Some of his advisors said there is no Russia without Putin, because for many people, they just can't conceive of, you know, someone other than Putin being at the helm. He is their image, you know, of a Russian president. Then there's also the fact that up until the war in Ukraine, I would say that, you know, for quite a long period, Russians, and I think we would all agree, those of us who spent time in Russia in the 80s and in the 90s, were kind of living their best lives. And what I mean by that is, you know, the Russian state was not taxing Russians. You know, back in the Soviet Union period, people were not paid. You know, and it was the old axiom was we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, because, you know, labor was taxed. You were basically essentially working for free. And so, you know, the whole system was breaking down because, you know, people, you know, their labor wasn't valued. Labor was being taxed because, I mean, essentially they weren't being paid. Everything was centrally planned. But the Russian state was taking all of its revenues from oil and gas revenues and, you know, natural resource taxes, as it continues to. That's one of the reasons why the Russian economy is still doing actually pretty well. It's not because they've increased taxes on the average person. We all know, you know, it's just tax day the other day. Nobody really likes to pay taxes. And, you know, the Russian state is not overburdening, or was not until the war in Ukraine, overburdening the population. You know, you go to places like Moscow, St. Petersburg, even out into, you know, remote Russian regions. There's kind of a feeling that some things, you know, have changed positively. Cities that, you know, were really you know, down and looked like they were not just left behind, but were totally forgotten, had got, you know, so at least some superficial regeneration because of, you know, floods of investment money from oil and gas. It did, you know, trickle down, or, you know, people were actually actively trying to regenerate. I mean, some parts of Russia actually did look untouched since the 19th century as well. But, you know, for the most part, people were actually seeing, you know, progress there. And they were not, again, until fairly recently, feeling, you know, particularly hard put upon in terms of political repression. Things have changed, you know, really quite dramatically. And that change does start with Putin with the annexation of Crimea. And then as, kind of definitely we've moved towards war in Ukraine, things have shifted. But I think, people are still reflecting, those facts that actually if they look back to how their parents lived or how they themselves lived in the 90s or in early 2000s where things were quite difficult, they can actually say our lives have improved. And I think one of the mistakes that we all made when, we saw the end of communism, and maybe, even in the times when, we were there in the Soviet period when, people were talking about wanting to be like America, wanting to be like Europe. They wanted to live like America and Europe. They didn't want to be us. And, we made, often those mistakes that, kind of people are feeling like they're living their best versions of their lives in terms of travel and everything else. Now, the war has changed that rather dramatically. But I think that that is still, having an impact and shaping the way that people think about things.
Thank you. Thank you. So that's a good segue into war. We're 2 years into that. It started badly. But since then, Russia seems to have coped reasonably well with manpower and armament shortages. Its army has adapted sort of to the 21st century drone warfare. Russian lines seem to be holding. There have been some advances recently. Western support, which was never particularly strong, has frayed, including in particular here. The current battle, the state of play of the battlefront seems to be a stalemate. That probably serves Putin's interests, perhaps. But how do you see the state of play in Ukraine and the stakes for American interests? What are the prospects for getting back to peace? What happens if Russia really is able to advance in a very big way?
Well, there are multiple things at play here. So let me try to see if I can, unpack some of them, because there's what's happening in Russia itself that, I think we could, as I said, was kind of foreshadowing the fact that things have, changed in Russia as well as a result of the war. There's what's obviously happening in Ukraine and to Ukraine because of, what was really Putin's own decision to invade. This isn't a kind of collective decision of, a large swath, certainly not of the Russian population. There was no support for, being even mobilized for going into Ukraine, which is why Putin called it a special military operation. He thought it would be all over with before anybody had noticed, particularly on the Russian population side, because even though it was actually a pretty formidable force that was gathered there, I mean, most of the Russian soldiers thought they were having exercises, and it was never a large enough force to occupy the whole country because Putin didn't think they would have to. He thought that the Ukrainian government would just crumble and they would leave, and then it would be like 1956 in Hungary or 1968 in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, that, the Red Army, kind of equivalent would basically move in, a new government would be put in place, and then that would be the end of it, and Ukraine would be subordinate to Russia and perhaps part of a Slavic Union, with Belarus and Russia. And that's not, obviously what happened. It became a full-on war. So that is kind of one of the difficulties now, that Putin is now having to conduct a full-on war. And as you're basically saying, he's managed to shift things. And then, of course, there's the external perspective that involves the United States and also Europe. And then I would like to say, a whole host of our allies, because what's happened over the course of this war, and let me talk about, the larger geopolitics first, because that brings it to why it actually matters for us here, is as it turned out to be not a special military operation. And as you've just, laid out in the framing of the question, Putin wasn't really ready for that, and everything went disastrously from his perspective. He didn't, basically take control of Ukraine or Kiev, the capital, in a matter of days, as we all anticipated we would too. The Russian military started to need different equipment and, kind of fight the war in a different way. And that's created a lot of stresses and strains. Last year in June, there was a mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the guy whose plane fell out of the sky. And that was because, out of the sky. And that was because the military was not actually in as fit a state as everybody thought it would, all of us included, to be able to engage in a full-on war, and had to be filled in with these private military contractors who had been, running around all over the place in the meantime. And the private military contractors, felt that they were not being given their proper due. And, this is, then the origins of the mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who gets into a fight, as mercenaries often do through history, think ancient Rome and all the rest of it, with the high command. And he's marching on Moscow basically to demand to be in charge, essentially. Kind of Napoleon did that back in the day, but more successfully. And actually became an emperor. So Putin gets worried and thinks it's back to the past again, and has this amazing speech, essentially warning that it was more the Bolshevik Revolution again in 1917. And people are going, what's going on here? And anyway, then that sort of fizzles out, as rebellions often, do in some of these cases. But, think about what things might have been there had that, not not turned out as quite so fortuitously for Putin. But in addition to having to rely on these private military contractors, which are now absorbed into the military, I mean, Russia had colossal losses of equipment. And, you've alluded to this, kind of new forms of fighting as well. The Ukrainians managed to turn the Russians back in part by using drones that were provided to them by the Turks initially, and then by developing their own. Well, the Russians hadn't thought about drones. I mean, that was not how, they were using these private military contractors. They were doing sort of insurgent, covert ops and, propaganda and influence operations. They hadn't been thinking about drones at all. I mean, we hadn't been thinking about drones in quite the same way, but the Iranians had. So the Russians, had to buy a lot of Iranian drones. Then the war starts to becoming more of a World War I trench warfare with lots of shells and ammunition. I mean, when we're talking about the front lines in eastern Ukraine, this is horrific. It looks like Flanders, and basically World War I, Passchendaele, or something like this. It's just horrific to look at, and millions of rounds of bullets and shells being expended. And, Russia ran out of those as well, not just Ukraine running out. And they had to kind of look around to see, who they'd been selling it to back in the past. And lo and behold, North Korea starts, basically selling back to Russia lots of the rounds of ammunition that they'd, been sold in the past for, kind of prospective war with South Korea or Japan or, whoever else in the neighborhood. So now we have North Korea and Iran, both as protagonists in the war in Ukraine, which becomes, problematic for us. And it's not just because North Korea and Iran wanted to help Russia out, it's because we are helping Ukraine out. And so a lot of the dynamic now around Ukraine is really proxy wars with the United States by North Korea and by Iran. And, that's obviously we're seeing now the tie to Gaza and Israel, the recent bombardment of Israel by hundreds of Iranian missiles and drones. It's very similar to, the same kind of bombardment of missiles. And in fact, President Zelensky of Ukraine just pointed that out in public, that basically the Iranian strike in Israel is like the same strikes that Ukraine is experiencing every single day with the same armaments, because they're also coming from Iran. And, these things are very much tied together. And Russia is now doing favors for Iran as a result, and also for North Korea. And then we see China is being much more supportive of Russia than we would have thought, because China, prior to the war, was actually, and when I say why we would have thought, was very closely tied in trade to Ukraine. They're the largest, and still continue to be the largest purchaser of Ukrainian grain, and they were actually investing in Ukrainian agriculture and leasing land in Ukraine. They had no beef with Ukraine at all. But this is all about how China sees, possible confrontation with the United States in the Asia Pacific over Taiwan, for example, but also because of all the tensions in the Chinese-US relationship on trade and sanctions. And China's watching what's happening there and thinking, okay, well, we'd rather have the US and its allies bogged down supporting Ukraine than being able to, pay attention to, what's happening in our neighborhood. So you can see here that all of these conflicts are getting tied together. And so the rest of the world is watching what happens in Ukraine, and Putin is now saying it's no longer a war against Nazis. It's no longer a special military operation. It's no longer just about Ukraine and, everything else that he was saying earlier on in the conflict when he was making excuses for why he'd moved in, although he's still saying it's history and, that Ukraine belongs to Russia and Russia and Ukrainians' history is one and the same. But he's saying that this is an existential battle with the United States, with the West, and with NATO for Russia's survival. Because he's depicting it in that way and saying it is a proxy war with the United States, others are piling in. And that then makes it all the more incumbent upon us to get our act together, because our leadership, and our position is increasingly at stake in this, just as it was, in World War II, when Britain, was being attacked by Germany, when France had been occupied, and actually nobody here in America really wanted, to go into help either. 90% of Americans back in 39 and 40 until Pearl Harbor, well, this has got nothing to do with us. Even though we were at the time, close allies with my original country, Germany, we weren't exactly thrilled that France had been occupied or Poland had been invaded, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Adolf Hitler, and the Germans proceeded to maraud over, the rest of Europe, and would have continued to do so had the United States actually not come in. Now, the reasons that we came in were because of Pearl Harbor, but, at this particular point, nobody's actually asking us, to go in, but they are looking very long and hard at, our leadership and our position. And the key thing for Ukraine right now is this discrepancy between armaments, because Russia's managed to bridge its gap and build up its production, and Ukraine hasn't been able to, because all of Ukraine's military production facilities are being bombed by Russia. And the rest of the Europe has not been able to kind of rebuild back up because they're relying too heavily on us, to be frank. It's arms production, and it's all coming, down to us at this moment as the bridge, really, for Ukraine to be able to build up its production, and the Europeans as well. But I do want to actually say that Putin is not in as good a position as he wants us to think. We're all being very much heavily influenced by Russian propaganda about this right now. Putin wants us to think that he's won. And what he has done is just break out of stalemate. You mentioned stalemate before. Because of the lack of ammunition for Ukraine and just the sheer manpower advantage that Russia has, and now the ammunition advantage over Ukraine, thanks to Iran and North Korea, Putin's managed to turn the tide somewhat. He can't do a full-on offensive assault on Kiev again just yet, but he can if the trajectory remains the same. But he has switched out of the stalemate to be able to get some operational advantage and be able to, push the lines forward. The other thing is what Russia has done is dug in. So there are millions and millions of landmines now and trenches that have been dug, just to make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to, basically break through. But the losses to Russia have been colossal. Just to put this into perspective, we've got about 350,000 casualties. Now, that's not all killed, but that's people who are seriously maimed. You've got 1 million, plus Russians who have left and are, to avoid the war or in absolute opposition to the war. But that's some of the most innovative and capable part of the population, predominantly young men. And Russia already had a demographic issue. Even though it's like 140 million to the 40 million that are, is Ukraine, Russia's birth rate was already going down. Putin's now talking about wanting to, build the Russian birth rate back up so that it's a 600 million population by, I think, 2050 or something. Where are those people going to come from? I mean, the 140 million are not all women. And I'm just like, a lot of young men are being killed or maimed. And I mean, I don't know about women here, but, I'm doing the math here. I just don't think that's going to work, because the birth rate already, I mean, there isn't that cohort of childbearing women, as we like to see, that is going to, basically increase the population up to 600 million. Now, why has he picked 600 million? Because it's twice as much as the United States. And it's also more than Nigeria's projected, population, which is going to be the third largest population after China and India. It's a numbers game, because for Putin, the way of warfare is just throwing more and more, cannon fodder at the war right now. And, this is a historic look about its quality over quantity. In the 1900s, that's the way that countries thought about their power, was literally more manpower, for modern war or for labor-intensive industry. That's not where we are, in the modern age. And, I think that there's already a realization setting in that, Russia will be, not now, but, down the line, in trouble demographically as well as economically, because it's now a war economy. 40-50% of the economy, and the economy seems to be doing quite well, but is now a war economy. Arms production, interrelated. It's still flush with cash from oil and gas, especially oil and oil sales, because oil's gone up to what is about $90 a barrel again. and the Russian budget is set at, much lower. It's also in rubles, and the ruble is devaluated. So there's lots of rubles sloshing around, the system. But you're not investing in innovation, you're not investing in education, you're not investing in health. And, we all know that eventually those lead to significant problems, which is what happened in the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. So just as I said, I never expected we'd be back around to the 1980s again. Russia itself, after really an unprecedented period of prosperity, could be, putting itself, back again by not investing in the future and investing in past ways of warfare.
Unfortunately, Ukraine.
And forcing us to do the same thing, frankly.
Very similar.
Yeah,
They've
very
been
similar. Yeah, and the demographic disaster in Ukraine is pretty acute.
So we want to be able to get to some questions.
Yeah, and I'm giving very long answers, sorry.
But to sort of pull the thread away a little bit from Ukraine and generalize a little bit more, there are many analysts who point to something that isn't just Ukraine. It isn't just Russia and Ukraine. It involves these other China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, all with aims that really don't have to do anything. The other three, anyway, don't have anything to do with Ukraine. They have to do with the existing international order. As Niall Ferguson suggested, it's a well-coordinated campaign challenge against Pax Americana and the West. Talk about that a little bit. If you can reflect a little bit on what you see are the limits of the cooperation between these three that might at some point in the future give options to American, European, or other policymakers as people grapple with this turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, this war couldn't really have happened at a worse time for all of us, humanity writ large. I mean, we're grappling with climate change. We've got massive technological changes that we really haven't fully grasped the implications of it yet, from, AI and, all of the other technological, breakthroughs that we're contending with, that we don't really know the upsides and the downsides fully yet. We've got demographic change. I mean, we're a population of 8 billion. I mean, I was kind of thinking back to, when I was born, in the 60s, we were only at 3 billion. Obviously that's kind of just basic math, kind of, population growth outside the West, of course, because, I mean, our populations are aging. And again, fantasy to think that Russia would hit 600 million. But we've got to contend with a world that, basically, as our societies are aging, other societies have got this huge youth bulge. And there's just an incredible pressure, not just for resources, but for change, also in the way that the global system operates. And, what we've been seeing over the last several years is a real backlash that you're mentioning about from, outside of the transatlantic, alliance and the kind of, traditional partners, places like Japan, South Korea, to the existing international system, that it's just not responsive enough. When you've got a population of 8 billion and, you've still got the World War II era international system, the United Nations, based on the Security Council with the 5, permanent nuclear powers, from the end of World War II. We've got many more nuclear powers, and you've got this, again, this huge discrepancy, this youth bulge in, the rest of the world, and aging societies elsewhere, and, all these demands for food, resources, et cetera, et cetera. Something's, going to give eventually. And then, the wars have happened at this particular time. And, as I mentioned before, a lot of the world is actually seeing the war in Ukraine as a kind of proxy war with the United States, but increasingly seeing the war in Ukraine in particular as an effort by the United States and Europe to dominate still global affairs. And that's where you're getting the backlash in the United Nations. And Russia's tried to ride that, and so has China, and obviously so has Iran and North Korea. But there's a lot of tensions in their relationships as well. China's not that thrilled that Russia's become closer to Iran and North Korea, to be frank. North Korea is a rogue state in the Asia Pacific, and the Chinese, right there, and would have to deal with the consequences of meltdown in North Korea, or renewal of the Korean War, at a time when they've got plenty of issues themselves they're trying to resolve. And China is heavily dependent on the Gulf and the Middle East for its energy resources. China's not a major energy producer like we are, and they don't want Iran, basically literally blowing the whole place up. So you've noticed that China's been fairly quiet in the Middle East, and certainly, has not been out there, egging the Iranians on. And Russia and China, I mean, a few years ago, I would never have envisaged them being, together like this, as I'm sure you would not either. I mean, they fought a war over their border because Russia took territory like many other, European imperial powers from China in the 1860s. The Chinese haven't forgotten that. In fact, a lot of Chinese maps, show nice coloring across the lines, into what's, Russian territory in the Russian Far East. And they've put now the Chinese names for, key areas east of Lake Baikal back on those maps, not using the, the Russian names for them anymore. So, China, that's not gone out of their minds that at some point that territory, might want to come back home again. And Russia is increasingly becoming more dependent on China, not just politically, but also in terms of now there's been a shift in Russia's trade patterns. And Russia's selling more oil to China, but Russia's also now relying, because when it's selling that oil, it's getting, basically the payments in renminbi, is having to buy more from China, than they did before. And we're seeing a lot of sanctions busting, of components going through China into Russia or through other countries, Turkey, for example, Armenia, a whole host of others. But really those dependencies on China are growing in ways that, might prove uncomfortable for Russia down the line. Putin's very good at actually manipulating President Xi, so it's not like it's quite the vassal state just yet, because Putin, obviously knows that, and I mean, this was a little known fact to me, but I've learned this from many of my colleagues who are studying China, that President Xi actually loves Russian history and Russian culture. Putin is not that interested in, Chinese history and culture, apart from as it affects, Russia, but he's willing to indulge that and, can't take advantage, of that in relations. But over time, Russia's looking more dependent on China, and that could be very difficult as well. Now, when you look at, the rest of the world, there is no desire for having actually China replace the United States as a kind of global hegemon. There's also no desire to see, basically a new Cold War, or certainly not a hot war between the United States and China. Countries don't want to take sides anymore. And you've got a lot of countries that are major players in their region that want to remain major powers in their region. They'd like to see the United States cut down to size. They don't want Pax Americana globally or in their regions, but they don't want, the equivalent, kind of with China being in charge, and they don't want, complete disorder. So I think what we're going to have to do is try to figure out how to work with that. We're going to have to be more adept and more flexible. We're going to have to, do our homework much better on countries like Brazil and South Africa and India. And, if we don't get our act together, I think, other countries would be doing it for us. So, for example, one of the key thinkers right now about a new global order is the Foreign Minister of India, Mr. Jaishankar, who's writing a lot of articles about this. A lot of countries are looking to India, now for just some new ideas. Lots of countries have peace plans for Ukraine. Lots of countries are looking now at Gaza and Israel and wondering if they, should be more active as well. Obviously, UAE, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, for example, the Turks. Some of them are also active in Ukraine, like the Turks as well. But the world is reordering itself. And, while we're kind of, basically embroiled in our own domestic machinations, they're kind of moving on and, will move on without us. So we're going to have to get a grip on that.
Thank you. So to turn to some of the questions.
That was unexpected.
I didn't do it.
I didn't do that. Did we do something? Yeah.
There are three questions that basically
Is raising.
three questions on Ukraine that basically have to do with peace and the prospects for
Yeah.
peace. What would it take to restore peace between Ukraine and Russia? What are another question refers to an article that's in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by Samuel Sharap that looks back at the failed effort in 2022 to achieve some kind of a settlement. Talk a little bit about that and what you see as some of the prospects or possibilities.
Well, it's going to be a long process. And, one of the things Putin, of course, has said that peace could happen, tomorrow if Ukraine stops fighting. And we stop sending, Ukraine weapons, and if Ukraine just accepts that Russia has taken not just Crimea and the Donbass region, but also Kherson and Zaporizhia, which he declared as annexed and part of Russia, immediately after invasion. Now, Russia doesn't control all the territory of Kherson, Zaporizhia, or even also of the Donbass. And that's militarily, and also nobody else has recognized the annexation of territory. And this would be a huge threat to Europe and actually to, global order writ large. It is true that there have been other invasions. The United States went into Iraq, but we did not, Afghanistan, we did not annex. And, you have been in Afghanistan, and, all of the circumstances around that. Turkey did invade Cyprus in 1974 and recognized Northern Cyprus as a separate entity, but has not yet annexed it, although sometimes there are grumblings, but it doesn't look like we're trending in that direction. But there was the episode of the recognition of Kosovo after the Yugoslav wars in 2008. And Putin likes to say, well, borders have been changed by force, and, kind of new arrangements created on the ground. The United States pushed for the recognition of Kosovo in 2008. And immediately after that, Russia invaded Georgia, and then also recognized the breakaway states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So Putin's whole point is borders change. Borders can be changed by force. It's not the case that, Europe has refused to change borders by force since World War II. But of course, basically the partition of a country on the scale of Ukraine, it's the largest country in Europe after Russia in terms of landmass, even if not in population. The partition of Ukraine and the absorption by Russia of several major provinces of Ukraine would be an enormous challenge to the whole configuration of Europe. I mean, it was bad enough, as Ross will remember, on Kosovo. I mean, many countries in Europe didn't recognize that, and it has not stabilized the Balkans. I mean, we're still, dealing with the aftermath here. So the capitulation of Ukraine, the partition of Ukraine, and recognition of Russia having Crimea, Zaporizhia and Kherson, as well as Donbass, would not be a lasting and durable peace, and it would have implications for a whole host of other countries that have territorial disputes. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is that the Japanese and the South Koreans have been also supporting Ukraine. The Taiwanese premier recently spoke out against, the lack of support for Ukraine, because they all think that this would then lead to disaster for them, in terms of territorial disputes with China or with North Korea, with Russia, also in the case of Japan. The Indians don't like this either, because they have territorial disputes with Pakistan over Kashmir, but also with China in the Himalayas, and have actually fought battles over this territory. The second aspect of this, so you can see that I'm pushing against the idea that, things could be resolved in, kind of quick heartbeat by, kind of some capitulation and partition, or suggesting that Ukraine, doesn't join NATO or not be able to defend itself, is the other knock-on effect from this. Ukraine, along with Kazakhstan and Belarus, inherited a pretty large, sizable strategic nuclear arsenal from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1994, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed an agreement. You'll always be hearing about this, the Budapest Memorandum, assuring Ukraine that we would, come to their assistance. Russia did this too, by the way. They came to their assistance in a different sort of way. If their territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty were ever threatened, if they gave up the nuclear weapons. So the message from all of this is, right, okay, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you give them up, you can be invaded by your neighbor. And if you want to invade your neighbor, it's a good idea to have nuclear weapons, because one of the reasons that we've all been so deterred from helping Ukraine is because Putin has threatened the use of a nuclear weapon repeatedly, and has talked about nuking us, strategic nuclear weapons, nuking Europe, intermediate nuclear weapons, and certainly nuking Ukraine, and actually with much more realistic and sort of threatening prospects with tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. And in fact, those of you who've been reading the papers will know that there was at least one incident that's pretty well documented where there was a real risk of Russia doing that, when in fact the Russian military were bogged down on one side of the Dnieper River in the Kherson region. back last year when things were not going so well for Russia. And Putin wanted to turn the tide by using a nuclear weapon, and then got massive pushback, not just from the United States or Britain and France, but also from India and Pakistan and China and Indonesia and Japan. And, everybody said, absolutely no, don't do that. But there's now increasing discussion outside of the countries that have already acquired nuclear weapons, India and Pakistan and, others, for example, about should we get a nuclear weapon? So you hear the Turks talk about it, you hear the Germans talking about it, the British and the French are talking about whether Europe needs its own separate nuclear umbrella, because is the United States going to still be sufficient within NATO, particularly given all of our backwards and forwards on all of these issues to, deter another nuclear power. You get the Saudis would like to have a nuclear weapon, not just the Iranians. And if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, the Saudis certainly want to have a nuclear weapon. You can see where we're going here. So whatever we do in terms of resolving this, and we're talking about a just and durable peace, that respects international order, we have to think about some of these second order issues for the world order that we're currently in, the nuclear order, as well as the territorial order. We do not want to do anything that would set a precedent for other powers to invade their neighbors. Because what Putin wants to show is that war works as a means of changing borders, and also that being a nuclear power works if you want to basically do this. And we have to basically show, and this will be the only way that we get to a just and durable peace, that war does not work. Now, even if that means that, kind of all of Ukraine's aims are not satisfied, whatever we come up with has to be done on the precedent that it was Putin who was in the wrong. This wasn't caused by NATO or the United States or anybody else that anybody wants to blame. This was Vladimir Putin's decision, and that Ukraine is in the right. Ukraine has the right, just like every other country, to its territorial integrity and its independence and sovereignty, because Ukraine has been recognized in these borders, including by Russia, over and over and over again for the last 30 years plus, since 1991, just as so many other countries have been as well. And the partition of Ukraine would take us back to the partitions of Poland, back to that prehistory that Putin's all talking about, the partitions of every country that we think of. And it would really be setting, a very bad precedent for international law. So this means a lot of diplomacy. It means, kind of a lot of hard-headedness. And it also means we have to change the calculation of a lot of the countries that are currently either sitting this out or actually supporting Russia. If China basically said to Russia, look, okay, the game's up. We need to get this resolved. It's hurting our interests, or, this instability is bad for us. Say we took down the temperature in our relations and China had more incentive to work with us, that would shift things. If because of what's happening in Gaza and in Israel, other countries suddenly said, look, we've got the whole world's on fire here. We need to start looking for something that could put us in a positive direction and set a precedent for other places, or at least for a peace process. Let's move on Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are trying to do that, actually. The Swiss are holding for the Ukrainians, it's kind of called a peace conference, but it's really a kind of a diplomatic effort for Ukraine to get more countries thinking in this direction in Switzerland in June. If we could get some momentum in that way, where Ukraine's got more diplomatic support, we might be able to have, real negotiation. And if we look back to what did or did not happen in March of 2022, none of those conditions were really there. Putin, at that point, after launching his special military operation, was forced into actually pulling the troops back, and wanted to enter into a pretty quick set of negotiations that weren't really kind of framed in this particular way. And there has to be assurances, not just assurances, but ironclad guarantees that Russia will not do this again. And that won't come from Ukraine basically demilitarizing itself. Because another lesson in this regard is the Finns in 1939, 1940, and there's a lot of Finns here in Minnesota. In 1939, Finland was invaded by Stalin, who wanted to bring Finland back into the Soviet Union, because Finland, just like Poland and Ukraine and and the Baltic states and other countries, had actually got their independence immediately after World War I with the collapse of the Russian Empire. Ukraine was pulled back in that period. The Baltic states managed to stay independent. Poland stayed independent. Finland had stayed independent. And Stalin wanted to reverse that. The Baltic states were pulled back into the Soviet Union, but Finland fought the Russians off, in fact, to the kind of point, where we are with Ukraine, and the Finns got no assistance whatsoever. And what happened was Stalin rethought whether he wanted to keep pursuing the war in 1940, because one of his senior officials basically defected to Japan, and Stalin had already had in his mind he was going to invade Japan at some point because he wanted to take the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin back from the Japanese that they'd got at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And that was kind of, cat was out of the bag. And he also worried that other countries might intervene on Finland's behalf. And he was basically trying to consolidate his position with the Baltic states, and elsewhere. And he pushes the Finns, basically for a negotiation. The Finns were skeptical and kept on fighting. And, Stalin, like Putin, had taken a lot of Finnish territory. But ultimately, the Finns decided to negotiate. And although they lost Karelia and a chunk of territory, they really gained their freedom and independence. And the Finns then built up, they were not neutral, they built up a really formidable military. And they were always ready at any point to fight the Russians off if they came again. It took a long time for us to persuade the Finns to sign the landmine ban. They're talking about having landmines again. And the Finns never let their guard down. And so that was the secret for them, basically being able to preserve their independence. It was by beefing up their own security. And they joined NATO recently because they want to work with Europe to push Russia back. It's not because they feel they necessarily need a lot more help, although they're really worried about what Russia's intent is, particularly on the nuclear front, because Finland did not build up a nuclear arsenal. But they also really worry about the future of the whole of Europe, and they want to, basically work in concert with other European powers to push back, as do the Swedes.
You've referred to Finland and also Poland. There are a couple of questions that follow on from Ukraine as to what is Putin's next target, and at what point those next targets really become vulnerable. Is he going to be remain bogged down in Ukraine, or should we and should our allies in the Baltics, for example, and Poland and then Finland, should they be concerned in sort of a today timeframe?
Well, the Baltics and the Poles are concerned in a today timeframe, and you've probably heard that the Poles are building up their own military and have been for some time. The Baltic states have given pretty much everything they've got to Ukraine because, they are extraordinarily worried about where things are heading. And what I'd like to say is that those next targets are already there and, are having Russian coercive pressure applied, cyber attacks, all kinds of infiltration of their territory. The Estonians recently arrested, I think it was 10 Russian military intelligence agents that were kind of, and they're all constantly arresting people. And the Estonians will tell you they're always arresting Russian agents who are, trying to carry out subversive activities. The Finns and the Latvians and the Czechs have got these hybrid war centers that collaborate with each other, looking at all of the propaganda and influence operations, the assassinations that the Russians are carrying out everywhere. You remember in Germany, for example, there was assassination of a former Chechen militant by this guy Krastikov, who was somebody Putin knew from back in the day in the security services in the Tiergarten in Berlin, who's now in jail. And he was one of the people that the Russians want to swap, for all the various hostages that they keep taking. There's another, target. Please do not go visit Russia, because I mean, people, Americans are being taken hostage there. The recent issue of a young Russian-American ballerina from California who went back to visit her family in Ekaterinburg and is now taken hostage for giving $50 to Razom, the Ukrainian charity, because they found this on her phone. There's all these kinds of high and low level, again, poisonings, as I said, assassinations, subversive activities, influence operations, including, we're all awash all the time in a sea of Russian propaganda, as is now being admitted by members of Congress. And I warned against, in the first impeachment trial that, when we're repeating, all of these terms against, Ukraine, J.D. Vance's recent op-ed in the New York Times is filled with Russian propaganda. And people think this is, something that they're coming up with themselves. I'm sorry, it's all out there already on, kind of all of the websites. You can make traces all the way back. I have colleagues at Brookings who spend their entire time tracing back the origins of all things that people think are taking for granted that are facts. Well, yeah, I mean, there are facts and there are facts. As Kellyanne Conway said, there are alternative facts, and some of these are the Kremlin's facts. And, we think that, these are facts that we've just, kind of discovered. So these are the kinds of things that we're contending with. And then, as we're already talking about, there are threats already to the territory of other countries. The sovereignty of Belarus has been removed. Belarus had already had an agreement to become part of a union state with Russia. Belarus has been used as a platform for invading Ukraine. Belarusian sovereignty has disappeared. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, was not re-elected in the last election in Belarus. All the opposition and the others who had taken part in the elections that were basically heavily falsified are living in places like Lithuania and Poland and in Germany. Belarus has already disappeared. Moldova is under constant pressure, and actually, weirdly, it was almost like one of these Stockholm syndrome hostage events where somebody holds up a sign or comes up with a kind of secret signal. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, is doing some press conference and points with a little pointer on a big map to tell Belarus that Moldova that they're next. And he's kind of and everyone was like, what's he doing? But it's almost as if he was kind of signaling. When we always used to ask somebody to blink if they were in trouble, put up a thing as they're kind of going past getting kidnapped. This is exactly what Lukashenko was warning the Moldovans that next to the sites here. And the Kazakhs know that they're in trouble, Kazakhstan, because many Russian commentators, including Dmitry Medvedev, who was president for a while, talks about all of the former Soviet republics not being real countries, Kazakhstan having large swathes of territory that were settled by Slavs, by Russians and Ukrainians, etc., etc. So and also to Poland, and all you have to do is spend a little bit of time looking around on YouTube, and you can find all kinds of clear signals from very senior Russian officials and Russian television about what the intents are and kind of what else is in the crosshairs. So you don't have to imagine any of this. A lot of it's done for intimidation effect, but there's also real intent behind this.
There are a couple of questions that have to do with, go back to where we started with Putin. What does life look like without Putin? What happens to Russia? There's a recent Foreign Affairs article that talks about scenarios sort of, for after Putin. He's 72.
He's young.
That's not as old as it used to seem, but it's not, the clock is ticking for him. Talk a little bit about what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, this is also very interesting because if you look at Russian history, all kinds of things can come next. And, there's always a kind of assumption that somebody who comes after Putin could be worse than Putin. Really? I mean, he's already pretty bad. I mean, there could just be more of the same. And, if we look back to, 1990s, the Boris Yeltsin and you and I and others, here remember this very well. Yeltsin engaged in what was called Operation Successor for a very long period of time. Now, Yeltsin wasn't well. In fact, he actually died during his re-election in 1996. He had a massive heart attack and had to be revived. So an American surgeon, was kind of sent out, heart surgeon, to, do, kind of amazing heart surgery to, bring him back literally from, the Russians said he had a cold. Well, he was cold, let's put it that way. It was kind of like gone way beyond that. So, I mean, he actually was a, kind of not just a lame duck, but a dead duck. And he needed to, figure out, what to do next. Putin isn't in that situation. So he doesn't want to be engaging in that kind of thinking right now. But it took quite a long time to work through who would succeed Yeltsin. And Putin was not necessarily going to be it. In fact, one of the main contenders was Boris Nemtsov, who was also assassinated, basically by people close to the Kremlin for Putin. And we would have had a very different world if Boris Nemtsov had been the prime minister choice. In fact, any of the possible successors to Putin, because leadership does matter. Particular people's mindsets, and somebody else with a very different sensibility might have come in, just like Gorbachev And as was also the case in Yeltsin. And, nobody could have imagined life after Stalin had been there for 30 years. And, there was a bit of a mess. You can go and see the Death of Stalin movie and get the humorous take on it. Eventually, we ended up with Khrushchev, who obviously, had very different thinking and went through some, crazy reform period, but we had a kind of more collective, basically leadership. Gorbachev was a bit of a shock coming after Andropov and Chernenko and Brezhnev. There are all kinds of different possibilities, I just want to say, that are out there. It's highly likely that Putin is trying to position someone from the younger generation of the cohort around him. And he did that when he needed to step back from being president to be able to come back again later with Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev and I are pretty much the same age, like a month between us. And Dmitry Medvedev used to be a very different, person he's gone kind of nuts actually over time. He used to be the kind of softer, fuzzier, gentler, kind of version of Putin. And now he's the even crazier over the top version. If you've seen any of his recent pronouncements, he's all hellfire and brimstone and, turning the world into ashes, which is not what he, used to be. And maybe he's, basically, re-auditioning, for the presidency, kind of a scarier version of what he was before. But it's more likely that Putin might be looking at the sons, not the daughters, of some of the people around him, who are, kind of very vested in the system because, that's the system they've come out of, but wouldn't necessarily want to keep pursuing the war in Ukraine, for one thing. Then there's a whole host of technocrats that are still in the government. One of the reasons that Russia has been doing so well is because it's got an amazing team of economists and financial experts. Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Russian central bank, is probably the world's best central banker. She just, happens to be the central banker in Russia. And I mean, I just, advise people to look into her. I mean, she's really a brilliant central banker. And Mishustin, the current, prime minister, there's Sergei Kirienko, these are all out of that younger crop of people, the same cohort as Medvedev, people are in their 50s or so, who, came out of the Soviet system, but as young people. Some of them were Western educated, but not all, but they were educated in that kind of late Soviet and then early, Russian independence system. And they're very skilled at managing the country. And they could very well, take over, and you could have at least, for a while, a technocratic government. And I actually think that might be tricky to contend with, rather than somebody who looks like they're just in the kind of Putin autocratic, authoritarian, kind of mold. Because people say, well, we lost Russia in the 1990s, we messed up. We've got to bring Russia back into the fold. Let's remember what happened with Germany after, World War I and Weimar Germany. We shouldn't, be pushing Russia to make things right. There's all the debate about who rebuilds Ukraine, and we might be, less wanting to put pressure on a technocratic, Russian government that looks like they want to end the war in Ukraine, and be basically trying to kind of figure out how to rebuild. Because then the onus is going to be, on us again. There'll be a whole big debate about we lost Russia the last time. We need to bring Russia back in. How do we kind of reconstitute all of that, give them a pass for what's happened, because thank God it's not Putin, thank God it's, kind of somebody else instead. So I would say it's going to be very complicated. There's going to be no easy way out of this, just like, kind of in Russian history, there's all these ups and downs and unexpected twists and turns. I wouldn't just expect more of the same or worse. I think let's just expect complicated.
And it's interesting, as you recounted that, elections that wasn't one of the words you used. I found that fascinating. But likewise, for those of us that were students of the former Soviet Union, it isn't the Politburo. And that kind of training ground for leadership, or at least place from which future leaders were presumed to come, that also doesn't exist. And there's nothing like that around Putin either. So just to close the conversation, there are a couple of questions that clearly came from students here, thinking about some mixture of a career in international affairs, a career having to do with Russian studies. Both of us sort of went into this at a time when Russia was our principal adversary, principal threat to our way of life, also an extremely and that made it compelling,
Yeah.
an extremely fascinating country. What's your advice for people that are looking at careers in this field?
Well, look, the reason I started studying Russian was because of the war scare of 1983. And just like you said, I mean, trying to understand, how had we come to this point where we were literally contemplating nuclear Armageddon, and guess what? We're back, we're back full circle, again. So, there is that kind of imperative to understand what's going on. And it wasn't easy to study Russian, back in the 1980s either, when the Soviet Union was still around. The chances of going there were pretty slim. I actually, in fact, did through, kind of an exchange program. But it was, highly regulated, and it was because Gorbachev had come along in 1987, 1988. It was also because, like you were suggesting, I mean, it seems now, because we've had so much of the kind of cancel culture, approach to Russia, but it was through the portal of Russian culture. When I was, 14, I found a very falling apart copy of War and Peace in a flea market for like 20p or something. And, I didn't have a lot of money at the time. And, I picked this up and said, oh, this is a famous book. I should read it. It's 20 pence. I've got 20 pence in my pocket. And it was actually falling apart. And I don't know, for those of you who have read War, it was in English, just to be very clear. There's a read War and Peace. Tolstoy, goes on a great length about his theory of history and the great man and stuff. But I was more interested in the story. And the book was really falling apart. So I plucked out the history bits and the philosophizing and put them to one side. I was like, what a great story. So I did my own early editing of Tolstoy, and I was just like, loved the story. And I was like, started, to read more. And eventually I did go back and read history bits separately, and, kind of got intrigued in it that way. But it was really the weight of the current history, the present, the history in the making, that got me pulled in. And, I ended up studying history. And I remember, trying to persuade my parents I was sure I could get a job with history. I've proved it, but I guess it wasn't always easy. But I think the main thing is also retooling all the way as well. I mean, I would never have imagined to have ended up where I am, to be honest. I mean, I actually thought that maybe I could become a translator. So I really threw myself into studying Russian and learning Russian. I got the scholarship to go to Russia. I went to a translators institute. I imagined myself sitting with big, headphones on, doing simultaneous interpretation. It didn't quite work out like that, but studying the language and the culture and the literature and, branching out from there became important. Also, in the course of that, I realized that, the Soviet Union, as it was then, was a very complicated place. And just learning Russian wasn't even the half of it. And in fact, I got my break to study Russian during the miners' strike in the United Kingdom in 1984, because my dad was a coal miner, or had been a coal miner. I mean, not been a coal miner for a long time then, but as the child of a miner, there was an educational fund that was set up by miners' unions from around the world, and I got my money from the miners of Donbass, which is, of course, Ukraine. And the miners of Donbass had been twinned with my home area in northeast England since the 1920s, because Donetsk, as some of you probably well aware, the big mining and steel region of Ukraine, was actually developed by Western, including British industrialists, including a Welshman called Mr. Hughes, who brought Welsh and north of England miners over there to build up the big mine in Donetsk and the steelworks. And Donetsk was called Hughesovka after Mr. Hughes. I mean, it's just bizarre, So miners' delegations from the north of England used to go and visit the show mine there, because mine's pretty grim and very dangerous in northern England, and come back with ideas. But they thought the politics was a bit dodgy, so they actually tried to, when they came back, they eradicated all the communists and Bolsheviks from their midst. But they were trying to look at whether they could get ideas from the state-of-the-art coal mines. So I also got, interested in that thread and started pulling on that, learning more about Ukraine. I was a fellow at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, when I was doing my graduate studies. But the main thing was just trying to kind of branch out from this and learn as much as I could about economics, about history, about the politics, about the security side. So I would just say for, students today to kind of use everything as building blocks and have a bit of strategic empathy and understanding, the culture and the language, but also kind of figure out how the whole system works and how everything is interconnected. Because the more I've learned, the more I realize I don't know. And I've had to become something of an information junkie about, trying to figure out, so, many of the reasons, for Putin deciding to invade Ukraine are multifaceted. Part of it's also got to do with energy, because, there's peak demand for Russian oil and gas, just as he's invading. And, kind of knowing the history of oil and gas development, and, how the energy sector works. Why has the Russian economy withstood sanctions? Well, you've got to understand then the political economy, of Russia, and, all the kind of financial and fiscal aspects of this as well. So it is, quite demanding. But I do think that there is a career to be had, in certainly in foreign affairs, and certainly even, with history. I think everyone should take, a few history courses, any course, because, at least, to know where you are, you need to know where you've been, and then to figure out where you're going. But we shouldn't be living in the past. That Putin is a cautionary tale. He's a bit self-directed in his history coursing, as it was. So I take a few formal courses here at the university, or kind of somewhere else is getting a start. But and also think, just in terms of the times, understanding China, learning Mandarin, and maybe Cantonese. The Middle East, still a great time to be learning Arabic, and just Africa, and the future is really, places like Nigeria are going to be the third most populous country on the planet. India, the rest of the world, as I said before, is becoming a much more complex place. My daughter wants to study environmental science, which I'm really thrilled about, because we certainly have a planet to save. But really understanding much more about the major, world players: Brazil, India, South Africa, Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot out there to be studied and to be worked on.
I would just add, for those young people who are here who get bitten by the Russia bug or the international affairs bug, work with it. There are many, many programs that are here in the Twin Cities to help you get into that. That's one of the missions of Global Minnesota. And that is a good segue to turn the floor back over to Global Minnesota's president, Phil Hansen.
To Phil. And I just want to make a plug for exchanges. And I think, for all of you there who are still students, please do think about study abroad. We do have Russian students, still studying here in the region. If you can't get to Russia, if you want to study Russian, you can go to adjacent countries where Russian is still spoken. There's a lot of programs in places like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Georgia, and other places as well. But I can't say enough about the importance of exchanges and this kind of work.
Please join me in thanking Fiona.
I think the applause is a strong indication that we are all very pleased that you chose the path of becoming a diplomat. So we're very thankful for that. So thankful for you, for your time today, Dr. Hill, for being a part of our program with us. Huge thanks to Ambassador Wilson as well. Did a wonderful job of moderating our conversation. Let's give him a round of applause. Good work as well. Again, our thanks to the library for kindly hosting us here today. We appreciate the opportunity to be here and have us all together. Huge thanks to our staff and team members who worked very hard to put these programs together and to create a good experience for all of you. And of course, thanks to all of you, our members. And I would say to you again, thank you for your membership. Please, if you're not a member, come join us as a member for the organization. And if you'd like to help in other ways, certainly one of the best ways to help is to bring a friend to one of these events. I'm going to introduce them to all of this conversation that we're having. It's an intense world out there right now, as you well know. The programming that we're delivering is helping people sort of navigate that a little bit. And so we're trying to encourage more people to come and join us. And if you want to take an even further step, because we've had so many delegations visiting us from around the world this year, we're over 50 delegations. 6 of them last week alone came through our state. We also look for people to help as dinner hosts, because we like to have them have a dinner in somebody's home while they're here having their professional exchange experience as well. So if you're interested in that, good information about that on our website. And we have lots of people in the room here right now that serve as dinner hosts for the organization as well. So we're very thankful for that. Again, thank you to all of you. We have some great events coming up. We always try to tease the upcoming events. On April 23rd, we're going to have a special film screening of the documentary Copa 71 as part of the International Film Festival. It features the story of a legendary soccer match amongst some of the greatest female soccer players in the world that took place in Mexico City, actually long before there was a Women's World Cup. On April 25th, we're going to be having a program called Doing Business in Shifting Times, Doing Business in Times of Shifting Global Alliances. And it's going to be presented in partnership with the Minnesota State Bar Association's International Business Law section. And we'll be covering trends, regulations, and emerging challenges happening in international business. In early May, we've just received confirmation that we are going to be also hosting the ambassador of Uzbekistan here. So there'll be some programming we're going to build around that. So we'll let you know when that becomes available. That should be a very interesting program. And of course, has anybody heard that Global Minnesota has a gala? Has come across. A few of you have gotten letters, I think, or emails from us. Our gala is coming up on May 18th. We hope you'll all come join us for a wonderful evening where we're going to be celebrating 5 port cities with food and entertainment and an engagement around all of that as well. If you haven't had a chance, again, I so recommend it to take a look at or pick up a copy of Fiona Hill's book. It's a wonderful journey that she has been on. I think you get a chance to understand that journey a bit further and understand our world a little better. And it's a terrific read, and many of us are in the process of reading her book right now. And so I would encourage that as well. She did not ask me to make that plug. I just doing that unbidden because it's just a wonderful read if you haven't had the chance. Huge thanks again to all of you. We are doing our best to navigate this world, to advance international understanding and engagement. We can only do that by having programs like this, gathering us together, asking good questions, and becoming more learned in all things related to our world. And you're a part of that with us here at Global Minnesota. So thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks to everyone.